Live webcast of
The Big M. The Big M.
Experts are discussing all the presented by the Big M event coming to Cobo Center June 9th through the 12th, 2014. Visit BigMEvent.com. Now, here's Paul W. Smith.
Thank you, and thank you so much for being with us at BigMEvent.com or WJR.com. We're live, and therefore you can send a message to us or a question online at BigMEvent.com or WJR.com, and we've got some experts here that'll take on your questions. It's all about cybersecurity and the threat to critical infrastructure. The importance of cybersecurity has never been greater. We're hearing about attacks happening every day. Now, whether from around the corner or around the world, data is being stolen, corrupted, compromised. How safe is your data or data? Is your firewall secure enough to protect one of your company's most valuable resources? Here's what we can do to help close the door on threats and keep your information secure. I want you to be a part of this conversation on cybersecurity. We are happy to welcome in Pat Gouhin, CEO and Executive Director, ISA, International Society for Automation. Pat, nice to have you here.
Glad to be here, Paul.
We've got Eric Cosman, Operations IT Consulting Engineer at Dow Chemical. Eric?
Thank you.
And Bruce Billedeaux, Senior Consultant, Cybersecurity, MAVERICK Technologies.
Glad to be here, Paul.
Let's talk about the CIA triad. Not that CIA, but this CIA triad. The confidentiality of the information, the integrity of the information, the availability or accessibility of the information. What does cybersecurity mean in the world of manufacturing? And I'm going to start with you, Pat.
Sure. You know, we're here to represent the control systems side of this challenge. And I think typically when most people hear about cybersecurity, they think first about IT and the IT side of it. And if we go back to that triad, the IT folks look at it first to protect confidentiality of the information, second, the integrity of it, and then third, the availability or the accessibility of the equipment. From a control system standpoint, we flip that around. And we talk first about making sure that that particular system can't be compromised. So while we don't want someone to see what's going on, we'd much rather have them see that than be able to control it. So that's what we're here to talk about today, is to make sure the manufacturing community understands when we talk about cybersecurity, it's not just an IT problem, it's also a control systems problem.
And a very real threat, Eric.
Yes. We were speaking before the broadcast started. The difference, one of the major differences in manufacturing systems or automation system security is in the consequence element of risk. The consequences are different. The consequences of confidentiality breach is loss of information. The consequence of loss of availability or loss of integrity could be a failure of something in the physical world. So a plant goes down, something goes offline, product is off spec, something like that. So it's, as I mentioned earlier, it's really the intersection of cyber and physics, and physical things.
And your take, Bruce?
Yeah, and farther along with that, our systems in the automation field sometimes run for years without being turned off or changed. And that's so much different. There is no patch Tuesday. There is no Sunday night we're going to reboot the system. We have systems, and we were just talking before, you know, a plant might be designed to run for 7 years, no interruption.
Really?
So what do you do with that to keep it protected, even though you can never turn it off?
What do you do with that? How can you? We're used to turning something on and off when we have a glitch.
The way you do it, and the 7 years number, I think is one I mentioned, but the 7, there's nothing magical about 7, but if you think in terms of running nonstop for years, every element in the system doesn't necessarily run nonstop for years. The overall plant does. So you basically design such that pieces can be taken down for maintenance, and you have a certain amount of redundancy built in, for example, but the overall system runs for a very, very long time.
We know that hackers are targeting data transfers. Talk to us a bit about how gates and scrambles are helping, the role of government legislation, the vulnerability of our plants, because we don't think of that as much as we think of when we go out and use our credit card and somebody steals the information, a la Target or Neiman Marcus or all these things that have been big news stories. Everyone has a role in keeping hackers out. And what do you think will happen at an event like the Big M that will help cybersecurity in the manufacturing world? What are you looking for in that gathering?
Well, this is another situation where I'd say historically we look at it and say that's an IT problem. Let's let the IT guys figure that out. Certainly at the Big M, what we hope to do is to bring this other operational technology perspective to bear so that we have all levels of the manufacturing community there discussing this so that they understand that there are preventative measures that can be taken. And then in the event that there is an intrusion, how do you respond to that? If in fact data is compromised, how do you recover it and get it back? So those are the kinds of issues we'll be discussing.
And then June 9th through June 12th at Cobo Center will be the actual Big M event. And in fact, the Big M event M Exchange Theater panel will be June 11th, 1:45 to 2:30, with a cybersecurity panel, Cybersecurity Challenges to Industrial Networks. Let's start with that. How does a company, and you may think it's late, but it better late than never, and don't be sorry here, how does a company get started in addressing cybersecurity? Bruce?
Well, most of the publications and guides in this field recommend you have to do an assessment, and there are many. ISA has them. The Homeland Security has guides to do these assessments. But one of the big things is commitment. It's not much different than how safety was 20 years ago in the industry. You have to get everybody and have a commitment that you're going to do this, because without the resources, a lot of companies outsource that because they don't have the expertise inside. So one of the first things to do an assessment and get that commitment to do that assessment.
Bruce mentions ISA, Pat. Tell us about the ISA and its role.
Well, we're much like SME. We're a professional technical society. We've got about 40,000 members that are automation professionals, mostly engineers and technicians. They're all around the world. We've been in existence for about 70 years, and just like SME, we produce standards, we produce certification, we do training, we have publications, we hold conferences, all of those things to provide for the community of automation as it relates to manufacturing.
Eric, how do you, at Dow specifically and overall, how do you keep up on the latest and greatest methods to protect ourselves from threats?
Basically, it's get involved. Get outside of your immediate area of focus and get involved and do a lot of peer networking and involvement at industry level with organizations like ISA. We also do a lot of work at the in the particular specific to the chemical sector through the American Chemical Council. Mm-hmm. So the first thing to do is get involved and be aware of what's going on. And going back to the previous question, you asked how do people get started. Before you even do the assessment, you have to shift the conversation from is it my problem or is it your problem to is it our problem?
Isn't it everybody's problem?
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
I noted before we started the program, I mentioned how often we have Congressman Mike Rogers on, and we're looking forward to having him on again this week. And there was kind of this delineation between IT, which is what people think about oftentimes with cybersecurity, and it's been said that industrial security lags IT security by as much as a decade, which I find a little bit hard to believe. Is this true? And if so, why? And either one of you can jump in on this, or all of you.
I would say that one reason is that not until recently have most of your plant floor automation systems been using off-the-shelf technology. So they've been fairly proprietary and just in their base design have been protected. But as they've been moving towards common elements, Ethernet, Wi-Fi, they become much more open to attack, I guess is what you would say. So that's probably why it's always lagged.
Paul, I would also point out that, within ISA, we've got a committee of subject matter experts, about 500, that have been working on this cybersecurity challenge from that OT perspective for more than a decade. So there are a lot of resources out there, though those have been recognized by industry and the government. And, it's hard to make that assessment of are we 10 years behind or not. What we don't want to leave the impression of is that there's nothing out there. There is a vast resource toolkit out there.
And you're certainly on it now. And that's why we're talking about it.
And our committee, as Pat said, I co-chair the ISA 99 Committee on Industrial Control System Security, and the committee's been in existence as a formal committee since 2002. And I'd caution people about reading too much into generalizations like being a decade behind or a decade ahead. The fact is that the industrial world has been focused on the integrity of their systems for as long as we have been building industrial processes. Mm-hmm. What is different or changed is the intersection of, or the potential impact of cyber events on that integrity. So
That's well said.
All right. Who said that's well said? Don't whisper that. Just say it.
yeah,
It's
That is
okay.
well said.
We like it when people get along. That's well said.
Yeah.
All right.
Well said,
We have Joe taking advantage of WJR.com and BigMEvent.com, and this being right now live. And Joe is asking, what can be done to patch vulnerability after a smart device logs into the network? Is there anything that can make it safer? Who'd like to field that one? All three of you are welcome to,
Yeah.
but somebody has to start.
I would say I hope that device couldn't log into the network in the first place. But once it has logged into the network, there's where having intrusion detection, logging, there's a lot of tools that come from the IT field that are used to find out if that smart device might have caused an issue. But the real thing is setting up before is keeping those smart devices off your process, your operational networks.
Anyone else?
I would just add to that, if you look at the physical analogy to that, would you connect a piece of physical equipment to a running process that you hadn't verified was fully operational in a correct way? And the answer to that is generally no. So you should try to avoid doing that with computers and IT devices as well.
But then how do you balance security with allowing for third-party access?
I would say that's one of the biggest challenges we run. Some of the larger manufacturing firms, which run right here in Detroit, most of the large auto manufacturers, they have subcomponents in their lines that are supported and even owned by third parties. Mm-hmm. And giving them access to those so that they can maintain them is probably one of the current biggest challenges.
Right.
And there's several tools to do that. Not any one of them is a standard approach yet.
Are there tools or resources that we could reliably count on that are out there from the federal government?
Yeah, let me jump in here and talk about the recently released framework. Back in February of 2013, President Obama issued an executive order to create a framework for cybersecurity critical infrastructure protection. 1 year later to the day, on February 2014, that was released. And this is a document that's very comprehensive. It's based upon the existing standards and practices that are out there. Our listeners can download that at nist.gov/cyber framework. And the framework is really divided into three areas. There's a core, then there are profiles, and there are tiers. And it is not meant to be a one-stop solution for everybody, but yet any company, any organization, any manufacturing group can go in there and see what's right for them, whether they're just beginning or whether they're very advanced, and it has something to offer for every company.
If you're just joining us at WJR.com or BigMEvent.com, we're talking about the Big M event, which will be coming our way June 9th through the 12th at Cobo Center. We have these Big M event webcasts leading up to that big event. And we have Pat Gouhin with us, CEO and Executive Director of ISA, International Society for Automation. Eric Cosman is here, Operations IT Consulting Engineer, Dow Chemical, and Bruce Billedeaux, Senior Consultant, Cybersecurity, MAVERICK Technologies. Gentlemen, what are the security risks of critical infrastructures?
The same, basically it's the same, similar risks of any operation or manufacturing facility. It's loss of availability. We talked about it with the so-called CIA triad: availability, integrity, and confidentiality.
We're looking at electrical grid, the food and water supply, transportation, airlines, nuclear reactors.
And what makes the critical, so-called critical infrastructure, which is defined by the government, by our government, is 18 sectors. What makes it different for them is the criticality, and it's really the consequence aspect. And you mentioned, for example, electricity. Well, if you lose the electrical grid, we're all in a world of hurt. So,
sure. And
I
that's certainly being talked about a lot lately.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we need to focus on disruption. There's always the sky is falling people that says that people might go in here and actually cause major damage, and
are we spending enough time thinking about the realities of terrorism?
I think that actually is almost a red herring, because really disruption is the easiest thing to do and the most likely occurrence. But a disruption of the electrical grid is just as devastating as actually destroying something. So to get credibility, I think it's important to remember that it's disruption is probably the largest issue.
Well, it is, and that's what a terrorist act would do. I mean, that's what they would be aiming for, disruption.
Yeah. But if you think of this in security terms, getting back to that, consequence aspect, the industry has been protecting themselves and preparing for these consequences forever. What changes with cyber is a different threat vector that could precipitate those consequences. So the first thing is understanding the linkage between a new type of threat and the same potential consequences that you've been always worried about.
Because the threats are evolving every day.
Because if your electricity goes out because of a tree fell down or because somebody compromised the substation, the consequence is the same. The electricity is out.
Right. That's true. But what would you say then, and I'll go back to you, Bruce, why an event like the Big M would be important in the world of cybersecurity? Sounds like because it's evolving and changing every day, and you can compare notes?
Oh, definitely. And that's where we can have the in-depth discussions on how to solve and get started. And we go to so many organizations, and they just don't know where to start. We have all these really nice guides from ISA, but sometimes you need somebody to say, do these first three things, and then we can move on from there.
Pat, tell us, or maybe explain, the U.S. government's executive order for cybersecurity framework and the standards that were set.
Right. So as I mentioned before, this is a how-to guide that is really built upon standards and practices that are in existence and that are evolving. So the government didn't create anything new with this, but they asked industry to get involved. They held a series of 5 different workshops where they brought all of the expertise that's out there together to ultimately come up with this framework. Then they put it into the different components that I mentioned. In that core part of the framework, they've identified 5 different functions, from identifying the threats to protecting to detecting to responding and recovering. And so that covers kind of the full gamut, and all of the standard developing organizations that are out there that are in this space have kind of developed a encyclopedia of sorts, a how-to manual that will allow a company, again, to go in there, kind of determine their unique situation, what their risk profile is, and then develop the plan that's right for them. And I think it's important to note that many of the small manufacturers seem to think that they may not be at risk here. And while they may not be the primary target, just like catching a cold, these viruses, are out there. So you might find yourself impacted, and then it's too late to say, well, I didn't think I was going to catch a cold.
I'd like to follow up on that, because one of the things coming up, and some people are aware of this, that Microsoft is starting to stop supporting XP here in April, and there's always compromises of XP. It's an old operating system, and viruses written for XP might not be targeting industrial processes, but so much of the industrial computers still run that operating system, and that just by being exposed like a cold, they can be impacted, and they were never even the targets, and that's a real concern.
Well, we know companies are being attacked. We know they are. Eric, what are they doing about it right now?
I think, again, as was pointed out, you can become impacted by a discriminating attack, a so-called target attack, or a non-discriminating circulating piece of malicious software. And what companies, I think, in general are doing is they're trying to, first of all, harden their infrastructure to protect themselves against sort of rogue things floating around the network. I would dare say that any company of any size could tell you, if they felt they wanted to release the information, how many pieces of malicious software they deflect every day successfully. The other thing that they do is, as Bruce has mentioned, is they put in intrusion detection facilities, software and tools, such that they can see these things and react to them, and not just react to them individually, but also do pattern recognition. So that sometimes you're seeing an anomalous behavior that's not really an attack, but it's not normal either. So you're doing an analysis on that behavior in order to detect possibly preparation for a future attack.
Are there other things they should be doing?
I keep coming back to the same thing. A lot of this is communication and learning. The irony in this situation is it's not a dearth of information that's the problem. It's almost too much information. People are overwhelmed by the information. amount of information, and how do I find out what's most relevant to me? And the best way to do that is get involved in these industry conferences and shows like the Big M and network with your peers and find out what's working for other people.
So that's what you're looking forward to the most, I guess,
Absolutely.
at the Big M event coming up in June. What are the fundamental differences between OT and IT, Pat?
Well, I think we've talked about this a lot, and it comes down to that triad, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability. But perhaps the best example, you mentioned it, Paul, earlier, is Target. And look at that situation from the IT perspective. They had a breach. They had credit card information that was stolen. And what was their immediate response? We got to shut those scanners down. We're not going to put any more cards through there. Now, kind of compare that to a situation that you have in a nuclear power plant. There could be other examples as well, but there, if you've got someone that's monitoring from the outside, and they shouldn't be, that core of the reactor, and they're looking at the temperature, the pressure, the flow of water through there for cooling. What you don't want to do, what you can't do, is shut that down. So the IT response of, well, let's just isolate it, let's make sure that we put up walls until we figure out what's going on. Sometimes you can't do that. Eric had mentioned an example a little bit earlier about this production facility that was intended to run for 7 years. Well, if that accidentally comes down, you may have a week to get that back up and online again. And that's just not acceptable from a lot of different perspectives. So that's what we want to bring to bear when we talk about the OT side of it, is what are all the alternatives, and how can we make sure that companies understand the different response that they can take to a threat.
And Bruce, what efforts are being made to put encryptions and firewalls in to help with the cybersecurity?
Well, I thought it was interesting we didn't have a manufacturer on the panel today. And there's that. This really comes down to the difference between an IT and an OT perspective. I mean, one thing you could do is have all the machines that are on the plant floor all have encrypted data between them. But from an operational perspective, it makes them very hard to maintain. And maintainability, is critical to keeping everything up and running. So you could add those kind of encryptions, you can add those kind of firewalls on the plant floor, but the more you do that, the harder it is to maintain, and that goes counter to what the purpose of the system is in the first place, which is to make things.
Well, we did have a manufacturer, but when they heard that the CIA was involved, they respectfully backed out. And we didn't get a chance to tell them that the CIA is the confidentiality of the information, the integrity of the information, the availability or accessibility of the information. Maybe they'll join us June 9th through the 12th at Cobo Center for the Big M event.
Yeah, they'll be there.
They'll understand what we were talking about. How do we go about implementing the common security controls, things like antivirus software, firewalls, in the industrial environment? What happens if you do it wrong, when you're talking about a situation where you don't really have a chance to make a mistake, shut it down, reboot it, and start again? You can start, either one of you, on that one.
Well, I mean, we've talked about this already, but it comes back to that availability issue. And a very simple example is that if you, we're past this point now, but when antivirus was first beginning to be applied in industrial systems, there were incidents where the antivirus program that was designed to protect your system actually misidentified a legitimate piece of software as being malicious and turned it off. Well, that compromised the availability of the system, and in fact, the cure was worse than the disease. So in that particular case, I think we've evolved past that point pretty much now, because antivirus is very commonly applied in this space. But that's an example of sort of an unintended consequence.
Bruce, software that can track what hackers are trying to do and what they're trying to get into and how often they're trying to do that, is that out there? Is that available?
Oh, definitely. And I think those are the tools that come from the IT field that can be applied in your process networks. The follow on, though, with what Eric said, is that ISA 99 committee has spent much time over the last 8 years developing patch management guides, how you actually update that software and bring it up without affecting your system. So there's been a lot of work in that field through that committee and others. But to keep the bringing in, that's why you have to work together with your IT staff. They have tools that will make your system better in the process side, and that's why it's a collaborative effort.
Has there been enough conversation among your colleagues and yourselves throughout the industry?
I would say that I think within the community there has been a lot of conversation. It has been the right conversation, but I'm not sure that that's understood by others that need to understand it, that have a different role to play in manufacturing. Just for a second, to go back to this committee that we keep referring to, the committee is called ISA 99, but all of that work of the past decade has now been accepted in the international community, and it is an international standard, now known as IEC 62443. But this is a whole
guys
family.
come up with some of the best names. I just got to
like
say.
CIA, huh?
What's that one again? Because I might want to get that on a shirt.
Yeah.
IEC 62443. That's the formal name by this international
It's
group.
the International
Technical
Commission. Yeah.
Right.
Based in Geneva.
Oh, well, of course.
But what's important for the listeners to understand is that there is a hierarchy to this family of standards, in that the committee has looked at this from a people problem, from a process problem, and then from a technology problem. So the different standards are organized in that way so that, again, a company can look at it and say, do I have a people problem, do I have a process problem, or is it a technology problem?
Do the men and the women in the C-suites at that level understand when you come to them and say, we have... Oh, look at the reaction here. I'm going to blow the whistle on Pat.
I was not shaking my head.
Pat,
no, I
Pat,
didn't do that.
Pat
Some do, some
don't. Boy, do they? And then most of them don't. Because, believe me, they didn't come up through those ranks.
Right.
Because it's changed in the last week, let alone 10 years. And so when you come to them with an issue and you say, it's going to cost us X dollars to be able to do this, they go, oh boy, do we really have to do that? I mean, what's the downside? What happens if the worst case scenario? Because it's always about balancing the dollars. Oh, well, if it'll only cost us this, then why should we pay that? Tell me about that.
Well, that's exactly the conversation that we want to take place at the Cobo Center in June, because we're going to have all of the right people there at all different levels of the organization, and we want to have this educational conversation.
I'll give you an example that's very topical for Detroit.
Okay.
Look at the new CEO of General Motors. She came up through manufacturing and engineering. So if you were to, and I just use them as an example, but again, it's a matter of speaking to people in terms that they can relate to. So if you talk about a problem, cyber or otherwise, that could have a negative consequence on the integrity of the product or the availability of the process, you will get their attention.
Pat and Eric weighed in. Bruce, you have to weigh in.
I have to weigh in. I would like to draw the parallel to safety. Safety was a real big push during 2 decades ago.
Yeah, we had to push to get seatbelts. I mean, it wasn't, somebody didn't say, you know what, if we strap somebody in, they won't go through the windshield. And everyone said, oh, yeah, let's sign up. There were arguments against seatbelts, for goodness sakes.
And we're in this almost the same position now. And I think that it's a cultural change that we're going to have to work on, and that's what we hope to do at Big M.
I think that's, if we can say from this conversation today, one of the most important things we have just revealed and all believe in is that June 9th through the 12th at Cobo Center, at the Big M event, there is going to be conversation that is so necessary, but for whatever reason, budget-wise, uncomfortability-wise, or whatever, some of these things aren't talked about. But there will be strength in numbers, and you're not sticking your neck out. We're all sticking our necks out, but they have to see that it's for the common good. I really believe that, and I believe that if we can accomplish that alone, that's a big deal.
And connecting safety to cybersecurity is key because, as Bruce points out, we've already made the connection on the importance of safety. So when you tell people that very safety that we've worked so hard to assure could potentially be impacted by a cyber-related threat, then it's another threat that you have to protect against.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say the Big M takes networking to a whole new level. And there'll be those connection stations throughout the exhibit area encouraging really impromptu meetings. And oftentimes when you have an impromptu meeting, people's guards are not up, they haven't put up the shields, and there can be some real conversation and some real movement, an opportunity to learn about the latest innovations that can impact your manufacturing process. This is going to be an unlimited opportunity with lots of events highlighting the Innovation Factories exhibit floor, tech talks, Q&As with industry experts. It's all a part of the Big M, June 9th through the 12th at Cobo Center. We've had a taste of it here with our Big M event webcast with our guests, Pat Gouhin, CEO and Executive Director, ISA, International Society for Automation, Eric Cosman, Operations IT Consulting Engineer at Dow Chemical, and Bruce Billedeaux, Senior Consultant, Cybersecurity, Maverick Technologies. You bet they'll be there, just as we will be, at the Big M, June 9th through the 12th at Cobo Center.